There is this classic picture of Steve Jobs after he just won his first Apple Design Award for designing Macintosh. He is holding up a Macintosh computer with one hand like a trophy, and he looks very proud of himself. But if we zoom out, it turns out that he is actually in a room full of hundreds of Apple employees celebrating their success together. But here's the kicker. The reason why they all won the award that day wasn't because of anything they did at Apple. It was because of something they all worked on years before at Atari. Between 1976 to 1980, when the personal computer market first started blowing up, there were three men who designed some of the best-selling computers of all time. These computers sold millions of units and made huge profits. And so these three men were given bonuses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And while two of them cashed out immediately, Steve Jobs didn't. Instead, he rolled the dice and reinvested his entire bonus back into Atari. So instead of taking home $375,000 in 1980, Steve Jobs ended up with nothing. But just a few years later in 1984, the Macintosh team at Apple would end up selling even more computers than the team at Atari did. So when they received their bonuses, the entire team at Apple could celebrate together. In fact, thanks to his decision, not only did Steve Jobs become an Apple millionaire in 1984, but he would go on to become the world's first tech billionaire in 1985. Yet somehow the world would forget about all this and claim that his success at Apple was an overnight success. You see, 2021 was the year of the so-called overnight successes. Everyone from Lil Nas X to Willy Wonka got their big break seemingly out of nowhere. And while we love happy endings, it's important to remember that most things don't happen overnight. In fact, the things we perceive as happening overnight are usually the result of many years of hard work that came before. The truth is, it took Lil Nas X over 1,000 days of posting online videos before he went viral. And Willy Wonka's first book was actually published over 50 years ago before being adapted into the movie we know today. But the craziest part about the overnight successes is that most people still fall victim to the same mindset despite knowing this. You see, every single person who ever watches any of these stories and every single person who has subscribed to this channel wants to have an overnight success themselves. They want to make $1 million or become famous or start a successful business. But the problem is that they all think that it'll happen overnight. They believe that success comes to those who sit around waiting for it rather than to those who go out and get it. But the reality is that there's no such thing as an overnight success. It's impossible to build a real lasting business in less than 24 hours. If you haven't already noticed, making a long-term impact takes time, which is something that nobody seems to have anymore. We live in a world where everyone thinks that they can be an influencer by snapping a couple of good photos and posting them online. But you need to realize that becoming an influencer is an actual job. It takes dozens of hours per week, and it is extremely rare that anyone actually makes money doing this. And yes, it might seem like overnight successes are the norm nowadays, but they're really more of the exception than the rule. For example, your favorite YouTuber has probably been working for years before you ever found their channel. This goes for everything from TikTok fame to Wall Street success to Hollywood stardom. The vast majority of people who achieve fame do so because they've been putting in the work for years and years before. Now, sure, some lucky people win the lottery or stumble upon an idea by accident, but that doesn't mean that they're successful overnight. For example, Christopher Columbus is credited with discovering the United States, but what does that actually mean? Sure, he was the first European to reach the mainland, but there were already hundreds of thousands of Native Americans living there who had been there for thousands of years. And so saying that America was discovered overnight is just silly. Same thing with winning the lottery. Just because someone won billion in less than 24 hours doesn't mean that they were successful overnight. First of all, there were millions of other people who played the lottery that day and will play again tomorrow. Second of all, winning the lottery is actually considered one of the worst financial situations you can be in. 70% of lottery winners go bankrupt within a few years, and studies show that they are 8 times more likely to file for bankruptcy than the average person. You see, luck is just a myth. There are no overnight successes. Everything worth having in life takes time, and if you're too impatient to put in the time, then you should probably rethink what you're doing. That being said, though, sometimes you do need to take risks and step outside of your comfort zone in order to grow. You see, it's easy to just stick with what you're good at and what you know, but that's rarely the path to success. If you're playing it safe, then you're most likely just scraping by and living someone else's dream. So how do you know when you need to stop playing it safe? Well, let me tell you a little story. In 1984, Steve Jobs was at the top of the world. The Mac had just released, and Steve Jobs was now the second largest shareholder in Apple behind only Mike Markouler. He owned so much stock that he was worth over $100 million at just 28 years old. But you know what? This never would have happened if Steve Jobs hadn't taken a risk and left Atari. Up until 1976, Steve Jobs had been an extremely shy guy. In fact, he didn't even like talking to women. But this all changed when he met Steve Wozniak and saw the potential of building computers together. After quitting his job, Steve Jobs spent the next several months trying to convince electronics enthusiasts to buy their own computers. He also helped design the first Apple computers and served as the company's marketing director. And while all of this sounds great, none of it was easy. In fact, it was quite the opposite. For example, in order to build the Apple I computer, Steve Wozniak had to spend countless hours in his garage taking apart and rebuilding different electronic devices. Steve Jobs, on the other hand, had to convince over 200 people to invest in Apple, but to his surprise, almost everyone turned him down. In fact, in the beginning, the only person who believed in Apple more than Steve Jobs was his girlfriend, now wife, Laurene Powell. If he hadn't decided to invest $1,000 in the form of sweat equity, then Apple would have never gotten off the ground. But the crazy thing is that even after investing his time, energy, and heart and soul into Apple, Steve Jobs still ended up losing money in the short term. You see, in 1981, Apple went public at $28 per share, which gave Jobs a paper profit of over $1 million. But soon after, Apple's stock price collapsed, bringing Jobs' net worth back down to zero. And that's why just 3 years later, he would roll the dice and reinvest his entire bonus back into Apple. As you now know, this turned out to be the best financial decision of his life. But the point is that this was far from an overnight success. In fact, it took years of blood, sweat, tears, and insanity before Jobs' gamble would pay off. And even then, he was just getting started. After the Mac launched in 1984, Jobs actually got fired from Apple in 1985, and so he spent the next 4 years building Next, another computer company that wouldn't turn a profit for another 5 years. In fact, it wasn't until Jobs returned to Apple in 1997 that things finally started looking up. He spent the next 9 years turning the company around before finally launching the iPhone in 2007, which would cement his place in history. Looking back, it's easy to see that Steve Jobs built his empire over the course of 30 years. And each one of those years was filled with successes and failures. Some years he failed and lost lots of money. Other years he succeeded and made millions of dollars. But through it all, he kept pushing forward. He took risks, reinvented himself, and chased his dreams. And that's ultimately how he became the world's greatest tech entrepreneur. So remember, true success doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of years of hard work and dedication. So if you want to be successful, then you need to be willing to put in the time. You need to embrace challenges and take risks. You need to step outside of your comfort zone and explore new opportunities. If you want to chase your dreams, then don't wait for them to come to you. Go after them, work hard, take risks, and never give up. If you do that, then you'll eventually achieve success, whatever that may be for you. Do you have any overnight success stories that inspired you? Comment them down below. Also drop a like if you were grateful for the hustle of Steve Jobs, and subscribe if you want to see more underrated business stories just like this one. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.